Everybody. Thanks for tuning in. In this recording, I'm going to talk about Chapter 14, which is continuing on with the speech writing process. So today we're going to focus just on composing the speech. I mentioned we have class time set aside for this, so that's why we're talking about it. In this particular recording, we will talk about what it means to compose a speech, what your speech thesis or topic statement is or should be, your main points, what the options are for organizational patterns, and then the items that should be in the introductions as well as the conclusions. So to start, again, obviously composing a speech means creating one. But what I want to point out and focus on here is that also means creating something that's organized as well as engaging, because I can't stress enough the focus of any speech. Sure, you have to think about what you're going to say, but all of your choices should come back to the audience and the reason you're giving the speech. Everything has to make sense for your purpose and then also for the audience. What you're looking at here is just a review of what we talked about from chapter 13, and we'll cover again in chapter 16, but there are 5 steps in the speech preparation process. First, we talked about is thinking about your topic. We talked about some ways of brainstorming. So if you didn't watch the video that covers that, I recommend going back and doing that because that is the first step. You don't want to skip it. Second would be investigating or doing your research. We've also talked about that in a previous recording, so check that out as well. And so here today, our conversation is on step 3 of the process, which is, again, composing the speech. And as I mentioned in a previous recording, the rehearsing and the revising are really done on your part to make sure that you fix any errors or points of confusion, make sure your sources are in there, and that you fit in the time requirements. So again, our focus today is on composing a speech that has very clear structure in terms of organization and then also engages the audience. So the speech thesis is one complete sentence that identifies what it is you're trying to convey to the audience. This is great for persuasive speeches in that we might want to say, today I want to encourage you, or I want to get you to vote. I'd like everybody in this room to vote before we leave. That's a really clear speech thesis. For informative speeches, we want to be clear to change that a little bit because remember, for our class, this is an informative speech only. We're going to be using the following template that you see here. So today I'll be informing you, to make sure we know it's information, about the life of bees. That's just one sentence, a very clear description of what it is, what's the purpose of our speech, and what's the focus. Again, we've said informing, and then we've told them about what. This is not something I'm going to want you to put in your outline. It's something that I'm going to want you to be clear about before you actually start creating your outline. Because if you are not clear about what your thesis is, you're definitely not going to be able to convey it to other people, clearly at least. So again, this is a good part of the composing process because you should start here with, okay, what is it I'm trying to say? And how am I trying to say it? Okay. Once you think about your thesis, as well as your topic, of course, again, that was something we've already talked about. You should identify what your main points are. Typically with a speech, you want to have between 2 and 5 main points. Each main point should only be one idea. In our speech, because it's only going to be 4 or so minutes long, I would recommend, and I'm going to ask, that you have only 2 or 3 main points. When you have more time to talk, then you can have more main points, but it's really hard to cover, let's say 4 even to 5 minutes. If you have 3 main points, that gives you 1 minute for each topic, and about a minute for the intro and conclusion. Intro and conclusion really should be closer to like 30 seconds. So there's a little bit of flexibility, but a minute even for our whole main topic is not very much. So if you want to limit it to 2 main points, that would be fine, but then no more than 3 for our class for this assignment. The subpoints, which you'll read about in chapter 14, are the bits of information we use to support the main points. So if my topic is to inform you about the life of bees, maybe one of my main points is well, I actually don't know anything about bees, so this is a bad example, I suppose. But maybe I'm just going to make it up. Maybe if I want to tell you about, what the life of bees is like in terms of pollination, then the subpoints are what I'm going to use to describe the main point. And we'll talk about some ways subpoints you can use would be, if you look at this illustration here, you see what kind of looks like a house where the roof of the house is the main point. And again, you'll have 2 or 3 of these. And then underneath the main point, you have what look like pillars that hold up or support the main point. Those come in the form of a definition, examples, statistic, testimonies. Testimonies are like personal stories. You will choose the type of supporting information based on what makes sense for the main point you're trying to talk about. So if my main point is, again, well, let's see, something about, let's say, the honey they produce. Maybe I want to give you examples of how much honey or statistics of how many bees, I don't know, make honey. I would guess that'd be all of them. But the point is, that's what type of information is a subpoint. It's how you support or explain your main point. And this is why I've asked you guys to do, and the standard process is to do your research first, because your subpoints are going to come out of your research. If you find a quote you like, that's probably a subpoint. A statistic, an example, a definition, those are all going to be subpoints that should tie exactly and directly to each main point. You have different ways of organizing your speech, because remember we said when you're composing, we need it to be organized. Most people, I don't think, stop and figure out which organizational pattern they're going to use. First, they just think about what they want to say. You can think about a pattern first, which will help you choose your main points, or you can think about your main points first, but then I would go back and make sure you know which pattern you're using, because the benefit of understanding the pattern is that it shows you understand the connection between your main points. For example, if I was going to talk about the life of bees, and I really wanted to walk you through in the early stages of a bee's life, it looks like this, and then the mid stages, and then the later stages. I don't even know the lifespan of a bee, but let's say it's relatively short. But if I want to focus on the element of time, then as you can imagine, I'm using a chronological pattern. If I want to talk to you about the difference between the life of bees in different regions of the country, then I'm using a spatial pattern, because I'm going to say in the East, bees activity looks like this, or their lifespan looks like this, which is very different from, let's say, the Midwest, which is very different from, let's say, the West Coast. If that applies to your topic where you want to connect dots for us, if you will, spatially or geographically, then you're using a spatial pattern. The other option for an informative speech would be a topical pattern. And this is if you choose a topic where the connection between your main points are just that each of them are in fact topics that describe your overall topic, then it's a topical pattern. So for example, if you want to tell me, you want to inform me about, let's say I had somebody last semester do a presentation on Elon Musk. And I said, well, do you want to walk us through that person's life and achievements? And he said, no, not really. And obviously he didn't want to share a spatial connection because there wasn't really a spatial element to that topic. So he said, I really want to tell you a little bit about who he is, a little bit about some of his earlier projects, and a little bit about his later projects. So of course there was a little bit of chronological in there, and that it makes sense to tell us the earlier stuff and then the later stuff. But his third topic or main point was about the person. Since all of those weren't chronological in nature, it's more of a topical pattern. So again, these organizational patterns are just ways of thinking about how are you going to organize your data. You'll see here the slide talks about also cause and effect and also problem solution. And at the very bottom, I say for this particular speech, given that it's an informative speech, you shouldn't be using a cause effect or problem solution organizational pattern, because both of those try to get the audience to change their thinking. So if I'm talking to you about how climate change causes this thing, first I have to almost convince you that climate change is a thing, assuming that maybe some people don't, right? Doesn't matter where I stand politically, but I'm just giving an example. First, I have to kind of, it's implicit in my whole cause effect. Another example would be, what pollution, or let's say something about food, what chemicals are doing to non-organic foods. Again, the fact that I'm telling you there's some kind of problem makes it persuasive. So for our speech, because it's informative, your topics either need to be topically related, meaning they all relate to the same topic, chronologically related, there's some element of time, or let's say spatially. You have those three choices. At some point, you really, again, should be understanding how your main points are connected with one another. Then we have an introduction and a conclusion. The elements that you see here should be pretty similar to what you would see in an English class, either in high school or English 101, when you first start talking about writing essays. But the objectives that you would fulfill in the introduction would be you would get the listener's attention, and your book talks about different ways of doing that. You could tell a joke. Again, this is where you could use some of your supporting information. You could, start with a statistic or testimony. You could have us close our eyes and, do some imagery. You want to keep your attention getter really brief because the whole introduction is really brief. But you should get our attention. You should very clearly tell us the topic. Again, you're not going to be reading a thesis statement to us here. You don't have to outright say, today I'm going to inform you about the life of bees. You could just say, based on your understanding of that, today I'm going to talk to you about bees and also their lifespan. And that's why I don't want you necessarily writing your thesis statement out as a full sentence. I just want you to have a clear statement of the topic in there. And again, I'll give you an example of an outline so you know how to write it on the outline. And then you would want to establish your credibility, which means, why should we listen to you talk about this? Well, the answer to that, at least for this class, is you've done research. So for everybody's speech, as you're giving us the introduction, part of your credibility should be, well, I've done research on this topic. If you are going to tell us about a topic you also have personal knowledge of, you can say that as well. For example, I had a student last semester who was a exercise science major, and she was telling us about different types of exercise. She said, obviously I've done research on this topic for this assignment, in preparation for this assignment, but also I've spent 3 years or whatever the time was as a personal trainer. And when she shares that credibility, it gives us a reason why we should be listening to her. So we want to be sure we add that. Connect to the listener's needs and interests. This isn't necessarily something specific that you say. In fact, it's probably going to be built into the work you do to discover your speech thesis, which is and you're choosing your topic. Why should this audience care about this topic? So even though it's on the list of something for your introduction to include, it's not something separate that you need to say. But you do need to clearly preview your main points. One of the sayings with speeches is, in terms of how to, tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them what you already told them. And what that means is we should hear a reference to your main points in the introduction. You should tell us what those same main points are in the body, one by one. And then in the conclusion, you're going to revisit those main points by listing them again so that we hear them 3 times, which means we have a better chance of retaining them. As far as the conclusion, you should start the conclusion with some kind of transition. This is the only place in the speech where you sort of identify the part of the speech you're in just simply by the wording. You could say in summary, but more often than not, we say in conclusion, which is another way of saying in summary. We don't say in my conclusion or in the conclusion because we're not trying to identify the part of the speech we're in. It's a transition statement. So we just say in conclusion, that signals the end. We want to summarize our topic and our main points. Today I've talked to you about the life of bees, and we said A, B, and C, whatever those main points are. You don't elaborate, you don't go into detail here, you simply restate your topic and your main points. And then you leave us with something to think about. That should be one of the last things you say Oftentimes, I think it's a good idea to mirror whatever you've done to gain our attention. So if you started with a statistic that said something about, I don't know, 85% of bees produce this much honey, assuming that supports your topic, then when you leave us, you could say something like, imagine, how much honey that could be if, I don't know, more bees were alive, something like that. We definitely want to keep it informative, but it should leave us with something to think about without being persuasive. And again, with each of our assignments, I walk you through what your outline should have, and I will give you an example of me delivering a sample speech so that you have that to follow as well. All right, so today we talked about the definition of composing a speech. We talked about a speech thesis or topic statement, the main points, organizational patterns, as well as introductions and conclusions. I do hope that was helpful. There's a lot more you can read in the chapter, and I do hope that you will, because the speech preparation process we're putting in now might be the only time in your life that you actually learn how to give a speech, right? You may not take a public speaking class. Typically at work, people don't pull you aside and teach you how to do this. They expect if you went to college, So I think you'll find the chapter helpful, but as always, please let me know if you have any questions. Bye, everybody.